Waterfall, the CCW podcast.
Good afternoon and welcome, or good morning. You could be listening at any time just because we're recording this in the afternoon. But hello and welcome to another episode of Waterfall, the water saving podcast brought to you by CCW, that's the Consumer Council for Water. We are all about saving water at home, at work, all across your life, saving money, saving the planet. Oh, what more could you want from a podcast? We've got a brilliant episode lined up for you today, which we will touch on in a minute. But before we get into that, here today with Karen.
Hello, Kath.
Hello.
And we're here with Tom as well.
Hi, Karen. Hi, Kath. Hi, everyone listening.
And Tom, I believe that we have long-term listener, actual guest star on one of the episodes. Tony V has been in touch.
We do, yeah. Erstwhile companion to this show, Tony V. We all love Tony V over here. Check out the episode where we explored Tony V's Water Odyssey, I believe it's called, where we explored his use. And he sent us an update. He got in touch with us, podcast@ccwater.org.uk. And please, everyone who's listening, feel free to get in touch with us. We love to hear about your water habits at home. And he says, quote, "Hi, Tom. My family, except my dog and I, are away visiting relatives. Being alone with my dog presented a rare opportunity to determine with greater accuracy my personal water usage. Over the past week, I've recorded my usage, all the while knowing my family members would not have their figures mixed in with mine. So here's the results. When my family's together, it's an average of 94 gallons or 362 litres per day of usage. This equates to an average of around 90 litres per person per day. And alone with his dog, for Tony, this is an average of 67 litres per day. And this reflects the following. 7 days without his wife, son and daughter in the house. They live in a house, not an apartment. As I mentioned as well, they have, used water butts. None of his habits have changed. His typical water usage routine remains unchanged. And he states that all of the water conservation tips that myself, Karen and Mike have provided are part of his daily water usage routine. So concluding, even with the weeks-long heat wave we've been experiencing, the tips provided by your podcast have kept our usage low. If my family would adopt all of the measures I now follow, currently they are partial adopters, my family usage would be substantially less than the 362 litres per day for 4 adults and a dog. I send you my best wishes and please convey the same to Karen and Mike. Also to convey to the audience that the tips presented on Waterfall are truly effective. Thanks, Tony V."
Oh, isn't that nice?
And I love the fact that Tony has taken the opportunity to narrow down his individual use and the difference between partially adopting water-saving tips and wholesale taking them on board. There are now numbers. We can quantify it. Lovely to hear from Tony.
I'm really pleased to say that this next couple of guests are really sort of pushing the boundaries of how we can adopt much better practices in terms of our water use and our sort of water using behaviours. And it's really been interesting to hear how they want to extend their thinking to take on board wider consideration of what we do to change people's behaviours. And it's fascinating to hear how they're proposing to go about this and the kind of really open conversation that they want to have, not only with water consumers, but, the people that can help to change people's perceptions and behaviours. So bring on the guests.
This podcast is brought to you by CCW, the voice for water consumers.
Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome two guests today. We've got Alison Browne, who is Professor in Geography at the University of Manchester, and Claire Hoolohan, who's a Research Fellow at the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. Hello, Alison. Hello, Claire. How are you guys?
Hi. Thanks for having us.
I think we're just going to start with what on earth is a Tyndall Centre?
So the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research it's a group within the University of Manchester, or I am a member of the group that's in the University of Manchester. We're actually 4 or possibly currently 5 universities are involved in the Tyndall Centre. So it's a multi-institution centre that's been around for 24 years this year, and looks at kind of all aspects of climate change research. We do this sort of usual things on carbon emissions and modelling and budgeting, but we also do lots around adaptation and governance and like people's experiences of climate and responses to climate change. So we do all kinds of research. It's a very big group across 4 universities, and yeah, we've been around for quite a while.
So Alison and Claire, you're both based in Manchester then, is that correct?
Yeah, we're both at the University of Manchester. So Claire's in the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change, and I'm based in geography at the University of Manchester, with links to the Sustainable Consumption Institute, Manchester Urban Institute, and others.
One of the key reasons why we wanted to speak to you today was obviously because you've both been involved in a really innovative project called Enabling Water Smart Communities. We'd really be interested in understanding a bit more about what a smart water community actually is.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a hard question to answer. So enabling water smart communities is one of the Ofwat-funded innovation projects. And what we're looking at is the relationship between integrated water management, community engagement, and social practices. So what people do in their homes and how people interact around homes and water. And there isn't a definition of water smart communities. So an unfortunate answer to the first question, but that's because it's kind of one of the things that we're looking at in this project. So the key principle is that we're looking at new housing developments that embed novel infrastructures and novel governance arrangements to kind of improve social and environmental outcomes. So as a group, it's Ofwat-funded, it's Anglian Water-led. We've got lots of partners that are either in water companies or work closely with water companies. So our interest is very much in water outcomes, but we're also interested in how new developments kind of interact with other social and sustainability objectives, so climate change and things like that, but also just livability, what it's nice to be in an area. So we're looking at kind of different development models, different stewardship models that enable these housing developments to become, for a start, to actually make it to the point where they exist in the world, but also have an impact. So we're looking at kind of both the technology options and also the policies and management models and the skills and the norms that exist within these sorts of communities to see what impact they'll have. And I guess just to say our particular role, because it is a big project, our particular role is trying to understand what sorts of expectations people have of new housing and how sustainable water futures fit into that picture. So when I say people, we mean both professional communities, but also people that will live in the homes.
One of the things is a lot of what we're interested in is how these communities are designed and how they're implemented and how they're maintained over time, because those professional visions that then get realised into the structure of a house or what a community garden looks like, those sorts of material features of those communities create sort of lock-in for practices. So the stuff that we have in our lives, locks us into a particular way of doing everyday life. And it's really that we're interested in thinking about, not only the technical and the design aspects of those spaces, but how then those spaces will be used, particularly around water, but also thinking about how other spaces of practices, like people's mobility practices or how they do gardening or community gardening, those sorts of things, use water in the home gardens and communities. And we're really trying to get an understanding of how that will change, how we can do that better, and then to feed those insights into design, building, maintenance processes, and also the other regulatory things that fit around that.
So how far along is the project then? It sounds like from the way you're talking that you're quite early on. Is that right?
We're about a year in, I think. With at least a year to go, I think possibly as much as 2. So no, not that early on, but it's certainly I think the further we get into this, you realise how big a topic it is and how diverse these communities are as well.
And are any smart water smart, sorry, I always want to say smart water communities, not water smart communities. Do any water smart communities exist yet?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that we've just done is we've been doing a review of, our group have been looking at UK case studies. We've got, we work with researchers at UEA as well, who've been looking more internationally. And there's lots of examples of these. I think we're still asking questions about what does it mean to think about kind of making this a more common model, if not the standard model? And I don't think there is yet a set of standards, if you like. There's lots of variation in these. I did ask, so Ella, our research associate on this project, has just finished this review. So we asked her for her best examples. Ali, do you want to say about that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the things that she wanted us to note on the podcast actually was that many existing communities and that take into consideration water-related issues, so we're sort of thinking about them as these water smart communities, tend to focus just on one aspect of water management. So, for example, they may focus on preventing flooding. Approaches that integrate a more expansive understanding of how water may behave, for want of a better word, under conditions of climate change, which we know in the UK is going to flip between flood and drought and an unpredictability of that. A more integrated approach to considering water systems is less common within existing water smart communities in the UK, at least, and they tend to rely on quite technical solutions. So there are examples as well where blue and green infrastructure is being mobilised within some of the communities. It's still imagined as quite a technical thing. And going back to what Claire and I were talking about a little bit earlier, thinking about the technical solutions, that is, and the natural solutions is really important. But we also do really need to think about the sort of practice solutions. So that's where some of the examples that Ella Foggett has put up in the review are really, really interesting. She's found one called One Planet Development in Wales, which is really interesting, where residents sort of primarily meet together to talk about water needs through rainwater collection and thinking about springs and streams, thinking about nutrient recovery from on-site wastewater treatment facilities and things like that. So there are emerging examples in the UK of things we would call sort of water smart communities, but they still tend to be sort of siloed in the approach to water. And as I said, more focused on the technical.
And if we were walking through these water smart communities, what would be some of those features that we would be able to see? You talked about blue-green infrastructure.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a great question. I think for some of them, you might not be able to see very much at all, because for some of these developments, that what the aim is here is to make something that fundamentally feels and looks and is like living in any other place, but does it better. But actually, when we've looked across all of these different examples that exist at the moment and the ones that are planned, what you tend to find is they're lovely and green. They include lots of like sustainable urban drainage features. So you've got things like soakaways and green space, and lots of like storage for water in the landscape, lots of greenery that can soak up water nice and effectively. You see more things like rainwater tanks, like visible rainwater tanks, either on roofs or in gardens and things like this, although some of that stuff is hidden too. So there are the kind of like these classic things that you see. But we also saw things like community, what's the right word here? Amenities, I think would be the word, but things like community gardens, sharing spaces. I mean, some of them like have things like shared kitchen spaces. Not all of them do. Lots of them are much more similar to what we would see as being an ordinary housing development. But things like shared gardens are quite common. And I think the other one that we saw is lots of them are looking to include things like active travel infrastructure and like some of the more kind of sustainable urban planning things that you might see in any other development. But these are coming from like a water first type planning place.
And some of the imaginations for these developments have water implications. So if we shift people to active travel, that might then lead to a situation where people are arriving at work and feeling like they should have a shower at work. People may, get home hot and sweaty from commuting on their bike from the train station or what have you, and feel like they need to have a shower. So one of the things we're also trying to look at is not just the water and sort of intersecting green environments, if you like, but also the other types of infrastructures that are being designed and thinking about the water implications that emerge from those. So the approach that we take to think about social practices isn't just that water, it's not just we think about water, it's also that water provides services in our lives, and those services are connected to lots of other aspects of our work life, family life, community life, commuting life, and things like that. So we try and be quite encompassing and expansive in understanding what in those communities are the infrastructures and that will influence those water needs and services.
I really like the aspect that it's not just about kits. It's about the community attitude and your link to the other things that you do in your life. So I like your example of active travel and wanting to have a shower. And from my point of view, I think we could have a community discussion about do you have to have a shower every time you go for a bike ride? I mean, is that no? But there's some social norming going on there, and I know. So Tom was laughing a little bit, producer Tom, because we have an ongoing discussion about what's the right shower frequency, and I'm playing more on the disgusting scale of it. But there is a whole community norming thing, and like if you were getting, I don't know, Claire, I think you mentioned the external water tank on your house. Some people might not like that if they were the only house with it because it looks odd. But if everyone's got it, then actually that's fine. It'd look odd if you don't have it. So there's that kind of social norming aspect that I think is really interesting. How much do you think that matters when it comes to water use? That whole getting the community pulling in the right direction, or is it? I don't know. Actually, just focus on kit. How do you see the balance?
Yeah, so I like one of the questions I think we often get asked is like, what is the role of social change in addressing these sorts of questions, right?
Well, that's a better question than the question I asked you. So, hey Claire, what's the role?
Yeah, I'm just going to
change?
like politicians start this. I'm just going to reword your question for you. But I think it's really interesting. Is like even as recently as 5 years ago, it'd be quite rare to ask a question like, "What does social change mean?" in a conversation like this, and actually, it's becoming like really core to the sort of work we're doing, the sort of interests that the water sector has. It's like, what is the role for social change in addressing water use, in addressing flood risk management, in addressing climate change, and all these kinds of questions? And I think like what our research really is about is trying to understand how and why people use water and how that links to wider developments in society. So things like consumer culture, policy and business strategy. So how does the kind of regulation and management model for water affect the way that people feel about water in their homes and the relationship they have with communities? For us particularly, I think the interesting questions about like what's becoming normal. So things like working from home becoming normal. We saw over COVID when everybody moved back into homes, or almost everybody moving back to working and schooling at home, had enormous implications for water use. So we know these big shifts that's quite easy to see as being totally separate from water completely affect the profile of demand, the timing of demand, how we actually do things.
So they were really interesting examples, and it just when you were talking got me thinking of whether the water sector is sort of asking the wrong questions, because we start with water and say, well, thinking about water, how do we reduce water use? But what you've threw into the mix, grenades you've chucked into the mix to shake up thinking, is that what you've said quite clearly, and I think they're very good examples, are there are other things that then have implications on water use. So if we're looking at a future where we're water constrained, should we be, instead of starting with water and saying, right, how do we drive down this water use, should we be going, actually, what are the other things? And what other shifts should we be encouraging, which may seem slightly tangential, but actually aren't because of the implications of water use? And are we looking at the wrong end of the telescope, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, isn't it? And also on the last question about like technical change versus social change. So one thing that water companies have done amazingly well in the last 10 years is that kind of the technical approach to water efficiency. Like we're seeing huge improvements in kitchen and bathroom design. That means water efficiency is increasing. We're like having better conversations with customers. That means people are, heading in the right directions. And all those things like water companies have been really good at doing is starting with water and working out how to make it better. To the extent that water companies can do that, they're doing a cracking job. We're then seeing like more recently, and particularly, so we work with lots of water efficiency teams, and within the water efficiency teams, the sorts of things that we're flagging are things that they're very like conscious of. They're very aware of the issues around them. And it's more of a question of like, where to start? Like, where do we start? What is the extent of a water company's responsibility and ability to actually act on these sorts of things? Because can a water company actually control what big retailers are promoting? Like, so this isn't something that the water industry alone can actually fix. Like, social change requires an enormous amount of like coordination between lots of different actors at lots of different scales in lots of different places to result in a change in a household. And I think like increasingly for me, I think it's quite inspiring, the sorts of conversations we're having with water companies. It's also very frustrating, and we share in that frustration of like, who is the right person to lead a particular change? Like, what change is it that we're aiming for? Like, what's more important, that people can buy a swimming pool if that's what they want in their garden, or that we think about water and environmental goals. So it's definitely interesting. I think increasingly, I would say people are asking the right questions. The questions are changing, and that's quite exciting. Getting to the right answers is a very different, very different challenge.
Be sure to head back through the archives and check out all the past episodes of Waterfall.
The project so far, then, has that shown anything that has kind of really piqued your interest in terms of, you know what, that could be a thing, that could be a game changer? Has there been anything like that that's come through so far in this project?
Yes, lots. I think we're learning so much on this project about what's happening right now. I think we've got interesting questions. So from us and our personal research, I think these conversations about actually what does the whole life in a water smart community look like, and what are the implications of that for the way that water is used? This isn't a question we necessarily came to the project with. It's something that actually the more we've got into things like the impacts of active travel on how people use water in their home and things like that, it's giving us this kind of like maybe an issue mapping perspective, like trying to look across these whole settlements in their entirety and think about what the consequences of that for water could be. But I think we're also at the moment having really interesting conversations about reuse, water reuse, both from a technical perspective, like how feasible is this, from a regulatory perspective on whether it's possible within a current regulatory setting, and also from a household use perspective, who's going to maintain these systems? How do people actually feel about having reuse in their area? And all these kinds of interesting social questions effectively on how will these sorts of systems, what role is them in the UK? How will they be implemented? How will they be managed? How will they be maintained? And what sorts of impacts will they actually have on the way that people use water? So yes, lots of exciting questions coming out. Maybe we're not there yet with answers.
And I think that I agree with Claire. I'm just going to add, I think a bigger picture perspective and things that Claire and I have been talking about together and with our teams over the last 6 months or so is how rapidly things are shifting in this space. I've been working now in this area for nearly 15 years. And these kinds of conversations weren't happening a decade ago. They weren't even happening. Some of these conversations weren't even happening 5 years ago. The space is shifting so quickly. But I think one of the challenges there, and we fly a flag for sort of the importance of social science and humanities and arts type research in this space, and an interdisciplinary approach to that. But there isn't necessarily the history, if you like, of substantial amounts of research from social science and humanities on water in the UK, at least. There are small pockets of people doing really interesting and exciting work, but a lot of this evidence, I suppose, comes from elsewhere, places like Australia that have dealt for many decades and generations with the earlier impacts of climate change, and then having to think about things like climate change adaptation 20, 30 years ago. So one of the things that we're trying to do in this project, but we also recognise the need for more broadly is a much more substantial evidence base of social science research that looks at the sorts of questions we've been talking about in this podcast. And as I said, there are really interesting and important things all across the UK, different universities doing this type of work, but there is a need for a lot more of that as well.
I'm really conscious that we could talk to you for at least another half an hour, but we are rapidly running out of time, which does mean we've got what's now known as the Karen question.
Yes, this is the sort of rather embarrassing sort of tie-up at the end where I invite our guests to share with us what they understand their daily water use to be. I'm wondering if either of you have come prepared.
You want to go first, Ali, or shall I?
I don't know. I don't have a water meter in my home. And so, there's lots of reasons for that. I was also advised to not get one.
Who gave you that advice?
I live alone mostly. So I think, but Claire, you can come to the why it doesn't necessarily matter in a moment. But I think one of the, going back to sometimes it's not about starting with water. Getting people to change their behaviour isn't always about understanding what your average water use is. I think it's important to understand where there's high use households and people who are already doing things very frugally and possibly don't need to change or might even need to increase their water use to meet their basic human rights and needs.
Alison, how do you know where you stand then? So you said, well, may not matter.
I grew up in Australia. I grew up in Australia during a millennium drought, and I've done this work for a long time. So I suppose I have more flexibility in terms of water practices, and I do like water recycling in my home. I'll take the water left over in the kettle and put it on plants, and I'll be flexible in terms of my showering routines and things like that. But I think that sometimes the personal use isn't always the question. It's what does that look like at a sort of population level. We need to encourage people to be flexible in the way that they use water, and to be responsive to signals around environmental scarcity, water scarcity and things like that. It would be great if we could get to a point where that was possible. But I think sometimes just knowing what you use and why isn't necessarily the thing that's going to make change. We need to understand what sits around that. And there's a bit of a problem with averages. I don't know, Claire, if you want to jump in there and talk about either your personal use. Huh?
Pinching all my punchlines.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
That was essentially my answer to this. So I could tell you what our meter says, but I don't live alone. And I couldn't necessarily tell you how you would assign the water that is used in my house to me and the other people that I live with and my dog, whatever water they're involved in a dog. But I think there's a bigger question in that, like, there's this really famous quote, isn't there, about what not all that matters can be counted, and not all that can be counted matters. And I think there is a real danger, actually, for the water industry that we obsess about that number of how much, like it can create the change that we need. And actually, it's useful for lots of reasons to be able to monitor and meter water use, and to be able to understand like how much water is being used and where and when and in what conditions, but not necessarily to assume that says, and this is what we do about it. Because to understand what we do about water use means that we need to understand the people and not the water. And we need to understand how and why water is used rather than how much water is used or when. So it's sort of a weird, like, I find this like compulsion to ask how much is used is a bit of a misdirection in the water industry. And we get a little bit over obsessed with that quantification, not realizing it leads us down a bit of a blind alley. I also think there's a danger that we use it as a bit of like a bragging right or a shaming technique. And neither of those two things are necessarily very helpful at thinking about population level social change towards a sustainable future. Because I think we need something that's a bit more inclusive and all encompassing than a me versus Ali approach to water use.
Yeah. And this idea of averages does get written into a lot of regulation as well. So I think that's where Claire and I are coming from on this, is that and not just us, like, so it's the Fullest in Australia has written some amazing work on beyond the averages, so getting beyond this idea of the average water user with her teams over there. But it does, I suppose that our cautioning around like questions like this is that it does then get written into policy and it gets written into regulation, and in some ways we can have a playful conversation around it, and it is useful to think sometimes comparatively about what other people do and why and how. But it's then how it gets enrolled into as a tactic for managing that we slightly have a problem with, in social science kind of critique. And we've written a few things over the last few years, haven't we, Claire, when there's been various regulatory change and kind of calls for evidence and things like that, where we've tried to bring in sort of a deeper critique of this idea of average water use and how that hides a lot of the diversity of what people do and why. It hides people who have really low consumption but may need to use more to satisfy personal need, but they can't afford it or something like that. Plus also then it hides the high water users who may have very genuine reasons for having high water use in their homes, but also they may have spaces where they could change as well. So the average question is one that's challenging because it hides that diversity of what people do and why.
Now we asked this question because we find it leads to a really interesting discussion.
Yeah.
Just has done now.
Exactly.
But we do use it to berate people, mainly Tom, who's quite elusive about it. Now, I'm sorry, Alison and Claire, I'm going to apologise in advance, but there will be some people listening to this going, hold on, you've just spoken to some academics academics
Gave you a
often
very
renowned for
academic
not
answer.
being connected to the real world in a practical sense. You've just asked them what the water use is in the Busendo. Typical academics.
Yeah, true.
But that has been a really useful discussion, because I do think that knowing what your usage is in some cases is exceptionally useful to drive change. In other cases, you're right, it doesn't matter so much. And we just had DEFRA on a recent edition, talked about the targets, and we were pushing them on this point on whether it was our individual cap or not, because I think that is a unhelpful mischaracterization of kind of national targets, that there's somehow a cap being put on people's water use, because that will instantly put some people off. So, I mean, this actually plays to your point. Actually, for some people, it just won't work at all. Look, this has been really fascinating talking about your work. It sounds like a really interesting project, and can't wait to see the results and what happens on the back of it. Because one of our sort of recurring themes has been that it's not a big sacrifice to reduce your water use, and I do think if some of the clever social techniques can be used, then people will reduce their water use without even realizing it in some cases. But it's about trying to expose that and expose new ways, and I think some of the work you're doing could really contribute towards that. Alison and Claire, this has been really, really fascinating conversation. You really, I think you brought a whole new dimension to the sorts of topics that we've been discussing on Waterfall. Claire, you and I in the past, maybe a few years ago, had a conversation when you were talking about dry shampoo. I can't believe we've not even got onto dry shampoo yet. I feel like that's a whole other podcast, because you guys are involved in a whole bunch of projects, aren't you?
Absolutely, yeah. Around water demand, around the water energy food nexus. Claire, you do a lot of work, don't you, around water energy nexus in terms of net zero, unflushables, all sorts of things we could talk about in the future.
There's also like big projects on sort of data, like how can social sciences be used to improve like our data analytics. So we've had the KTP with our TCA recently and things like that. So for anyone that is geeky about data, there's a water practices toolkit online that you can go and explore, that looks at how we relate the sort of social science research that we're involved in into these like big data sets and modeling tools that we use in the water industry. So yeah, there's loads of projects that we're involved in, but yeah, this has been a fascinating conversation with you both. Thank you very much.
What would you like Waterfall to cover next? Send your water-saving topics to podcast@ccwater.org.uk.
Oh, Garen, you were right. That was a fascinating episode. It's Alison and Claire there giving us some really new ways of thinking about people's, not just saving water, but the behaviour change element of it. Loved it. Learned loads.
Yeah, I mean, I think the really key thing I took away from it as well is the fact that this isn't about leaving it all up to the water companies to sort out. This is about us as a society engaging in those really important conversations about what we can do to change the way we not only use water, but the way we view it as well, and the importance we place on it. And that's got to be, the way that we go forward in the future.
Absolutely. And I think it's really telling, isn't it, that all of this great wider thinking has come from an innovation fund project, which is exactly what it's there to do, to challenge our industry quite sometimes set ways of thinking and help us all look wider to solve this problem that really exists for every single one of us. Well, that just about brings today's episode to a close. So all it's left for me to tell you is that we would love to hear from you. Do get in touch with your thoughts, your feedback, things you'd like us to talk about. Anything really, at podcast@ccwater.org.uk, and don't forget to have a look for us in your social media feeds. You just need to search @CCW Voice and you'll find us. Thanks for listening.
Yes, thank you guys again. Karen, Kath, cheers, this is brilliant.
Bye everyone.